Tickets are on sale now for Spotlight On's next live event, an all-ages show at the Royal Room in Seattle, Washington on June 22nd, 2024. Spotlight On Improvisation in Music and Life will be a unique program of performance and conversation between me and the James Falzone Division Ensemble. Together, we'll explore the nature of improvisation in music and how its principles can be useful in all aspects of life, for musicians and non-musicians alike. Different types of composing in the moment will be demonstrated, interspersed with interludes of discussion covering what each musician brings to and gets from the experience. Audience members will become participants through a Q&A session that will afford a rare opportunity to gain deeper insight into the art and science of improvisation. Falzone's Division Ensemble is a group of master improvisers that includes James Falzone on clarinet, Ray Larson on trumpet, Wayne Horvitz on piano, Abby Blackwood on bass, and Rocky Martin on drums. For tickets and other information, visit spotlightonpodcast.com or theroyalroomseattle.com. For those of you who cannot join us in person, we would still welcome and appreciate your support in the form of a ticket purchase. If you can, please do, as it would mean the world to us and to this important independent venue. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today the spotlight shines on returning guest, the innovative musician and composer Markus Reuter. Markus originally joined us for episode 130 back in November of 2022. He joins us now to discuss his project Sea of Hopeless Angels, which began as several unedited studio solo improvisations by Markus on his electric touch guitar. Those recordings were turned over to mixer Stefano Castagna, whose sonic wizardry included not only mixing, but fully collaborating with the recordings, adding new sounds and instruments as inspiration struck, including his own voice, various samples, bass, synthesizers, and other electronics. There are other inspirations at work in this project, but we will leave those to be revealed in the course of our discussion and in the show notes for this episode. It's important to mention the final collaborator for Sea of Hopeless Angels, though, and that is Aldo Grazzi, an Italian painter and video artist who, back in the early 1980s, made visual experimentations interfacing a video camera with a cathode ray TV screen. The resulting video retains every imperfection of what was then state-of-the-art technology. All of the pieces on Sea of Hopeless Angels feature video accompaniment drawn from these videos, which were in the Grazzi archives. Two of them are also accompanied by studio footage of Markus's original performances. Markus's first visit to the podcast resulted in a landmark episode for me in terms of shaping the types of discussions I could have with an artist. I hope you find that this one carries that flame forward. Enjoy. Markus, how are you?
Hey, so good to be talking to you again.
Yeah, likewise. It's great to see you. How are you? Are you well?
I'm well. I'm a little bit jet lagged. I came back from the USA to Europe on Friday, so it's the fifth day being back home, and usually I'm still very tired during the day. It's normal for me somehow, but I'm still complaining.
You have to reserve the right to complain. Are you in Berlin?
Yes, I'm in Berlin. I'm at home, spending a lot of time with my daughter, which is very nice. I've been away for 7 weeks on this recent tour, and it's really a long chunk of time, especially for a 4-year-old child. But yeah, I'm in my studio. I have a little studio room here, which I use for all sorts of things, not just for music, also for video and as my office. And I love the solitude. If there's one thing I've learned over the decades is that solitude is what fuels me. You know, having a family really makes it so hard to have solitude. So that's why sometimes, even at night, I go here just for an hour to do nothing.
I have a very similar setup. I have an office studio, keyboards over there, podcast over here, sitting reading area over there, working area. The time in this room is very important. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you say you thrive in solitude, though, given that I think of you as such a collaborator artistically.
I am. I love collaboration. I'm very convinced in what I do. Like, I don't have like many doubts about my artistic output, let's say, but I actually prefer collaborative work because I believe that it has even more value, let's say, because it's actually people coming together and finding some sort of, I don't want to call it consensus because that's not what it is. It's not that there's any compromise involved. I think it creates something that's bigger than what I could do. Like, the theme is that I'm interested in things that feel like they are not totally me. I'm more interested in what happens outside of me than what's happening inside of me. It's strange, but I'm always looking for something that surprises me. And I believe that quite often, like, my habitual patterns, right? They don't surprise me that much. That's why the external thing, like the external surprise, something unexpected happening, that's really what floats my boat. And that's also what like collaborators do.
It's interesting that you talked about that word consensus, because I did some work professionally with someone in a coaching type environment. He really taught me that that's not the word that you're looking for when you're working with other people. Consensus is not the thing to be working towards. He framed it as alignment, which was, I can tell you what I need and want. You can tell me what you need and want, and we can harmonize our needs and wants if we choose to go forward together. There's a lot that goes into that, right? I have to be empathetic for your point of view. I have to be willing to be vulnerable. But that's where you get real connection with another person in any context, in a relationship, in a work, in an artistic. I really like that framing.
It's true, because they like the questions are in alignment of what, and also in which context, or also in which direction. I think what really is like the most important alignment is the alignment of goals. When I say that, I'm not talking about that your goal has to be the same as mine, but that the things that we are doing in order to get to our individual goals, let's say, aligns as something that creates something that's useful to both of us.
Yeah, because we could have different goals for a project. I could want to just have this project be something where I get to show off a new skill. And for you, it could be, I need this piece to submit for a grant application. And that's okay. We could have different goals as long as it's in the service of what we're doing together.
Exactly. And like the funny example I always bring is like maybe a trio, a band that's working together. Like, the first guy wants to make the most emotional music in the world. The second guy wants to finally learn to play a beat in 4/4 properly. And the third guy wants to meet his girlfriend. But still, what comes out of it, and actually the result, and I find this most fascinating in my life, is that the result very rarely really has anything to do with the motivation that goes into it. It can have something to do with it. And yeah, that's also like this element of surprise that I mentioned, right? The idea that like maybe you want to do X, but you end up, at X prime, or you even end up at some other letter of the alphabet, right? A friend of mine, Bernhard, who I'm working with in the band Zentrozone, he studied art at university, right, at a conservatory. And he said that he had a professor that he said that there is a creative angle. And what he means by that is that you're never going from A to B. Once you start, there's an angle, and you right, and you end up somewhere else, but that is your B, right? Even though it was not your B. So there's an angle between the original B and the B that you end up in. And also the place where, when we're talking about collaboration, that's where our individual like path, but it's not a path, because, that angle creates a plane. And this is where like the planes of several people working together can intersect in interesting ways. And where we can, like I said, we can create an amazing piece of art that nowadays we don't really see where it originally comes from. We don't know what the motivations were of the people that were involved in it, but it has gathered some universal meaning by being part of culture. Obviously, I'm thinking about bigger names in the art scene or in music. I'm thinking of The Cure, for example. Like, for me, The Cure is a great example for a band that started a whole scene, a whole look, a whole way of living or way of being. And then at the same time, they have made albums that couldn't be further away from each other in terms of style and even
What an
lyrical
incredible
content
band.
and stuff like, yeah, incredible band. And going for almost 50 years now, right? 45 years or something. Yeah, but collaboration. Yes, I think, I hope I know why you mentioned that.
Yes, you do. In fact, there are some other themes that came up in that part of what we were just discussing. I want to come back to, but the last time you and I spoke was, I believe it was just turning into winter in Berlin in the end of 2022. So it's been, let's call it roughly a year and a half. And as always in the life of Markus Reuter, a 18-month period is incredibly packed with work and output. But there's so much to talk about in the context of Sea of Hopeless Angels, which is a new project or new to us. It's not new to you. You've been sitting with it for a while. It's new to us on the outside world. I'm very curious, as a way to begin talking about that, how you talked about intentions and A to B and the creative angle. When you were creating those improvisations in that one afternoon, I assume, from what I read in the material, were you thinking that they were going to leave you and go to Stefano? Did you already have that intention? Did you know what you were going to do with them?
I think so. The way that this worked out is that it was basically like a year or so before I had gone into the studio with my band Anchor and Burden. Actually, before I had the name for the band, Anchor and Burden. And I did the same thing. During the sessions, I decided, okay, I'm going to also record some solo music, like while the instruments are set up, and let's get it filmed. And so I did that. So 2 years ago, when we went back into the studio with Anchor and Burden to repeat the process, to record more albums of music, basically I repeated the idea because I knew, okay, let me just take 45 minutes, because that's as much as it was, really, only 45 minutes. So not a whole afternoon, just 45 minutes. Around noon, I just played. And the only reference point that I gave myself in those recording sessions was that I actually had a click in my ear. Just before I started playing, I asked the engineer, can you give me 60 BPM for this track? And can you give me 77 for this track? And right? I wanted the pieces to have very tempos. And I was being filmed by 2 cameras at the same time, improvising those pieces. So what I could have done, because up to that point, it was just a repeat of the session we had done 2 years before, right? But then I was thinking, okay, like, what can I do different with this material now? Okay, so now this is like an amazing opportunity, because there's music that's already, like the original improvisations, they're great. I mean, could have released them just as they were. But I was thinking, okay, but now what happens if I ask like a genius producer like Stefano to build something around this? And like the only parameter I gave him was, you're not allowed to change the timeline of my improvisations. So you're not allowed to cut anything out, right? You can mute something, you can put a treatment on it, you can put your own parts to it. Well, we can do anything you want, but don't change the timeline, right? So that, and this was my idea, so that when we sync up his work on the music, on our music, with the video, that people would be saying, like, how is it possible? How is it possible that Markus can play this kind of complex, non-repetitive music? You know, because it would be impossible to do it the other way around. So that was like the idea I had. And it turned out to be, I have to say, a great idea. I like that. I like that kind of thing. I like to use technology and processes in an interesting way so that it creates something that, like I said, that's surprising. Yeah, Stefano did just an amazing job with that. And like going back to the fact that I used a click track, as I was preparing the files to be sent to Stefano, I was thinking, should I actually tell him which tempos I played?
I'm curious about that. Yeah, did you include the click track?
I did not.
That's great.
And in some of the pieces, he got very close to what I felt to be the pulse, right? But there's one called Ghost World, which is track 6, in which you can hear that the tempos are off. But it's in the night. It's nice. Like Stefano wouldn't even experience it as that. but I hear my pulse, and what he, added to the track is in a completely different tempo, and it's fascinating to me. I love it.
The point about your one requirement of do not tamper with the timeline or the structure, it also speaks to the idea that in this world with near magical technological tools, if you don't impose some kind of constraint on yourself or on a project, you can often get lost in the tools. Like it's useful to have something taken away so that you can, as almost like a forcing function.
Exactly. And that's what I've been doing all my life. I've been aware of this all my life, that, say, in a situation where you have access to the horn of plenty, you might not be concerned with trying to find a tree that has like honey in it.
Yes.
Right?
I'm just going to sit here and get fat.
But if you're really hungry, that hunger, that's sort of what I'm interested in. I have to say, I'm really happy to report at my age, not that old, but still, I'm still hungry as ever. And I love that. And yes, imposing restrictions or certain limitations where you actually have to create, and I have to use this word twice, create creative solutions, right? And that's, like I say, what inspires me. To me, it's not how do you say that? It's not something that comes from the head for me. It's something that comes from the heart. Like the joy of discovery, or the joy of surprise, the joy of being tactile, even like going down to something that's really physical. So that's why, as you say, like technological tools, as great as they may be, they should always add a certain texture, like dirt and grit to the piece of art. If it's like a painting or something that you build with your hands, or if it's music that you're making in the computer, there's always like something wonderful about getting it to acquire a new texture. That's what music technology traditionally actually is about.
Yeah, that's right. Distortion,
exactly. Like in a way, people were not aware of that. Maybe they were, I don't know, I have no idea. Back when they were inventing microphones, right? But I guess maybe they were, because they realized that like the voice that I'm hearing in the room, that's the real voice. But if I'm recording it, it's never going to be real, because it's a recording. So what we need to do is we need to find like a magnifying glass, or whatever, however you want to, like which metaphor you want to use, a magnifying glass that makes the voice sound good, whatever that means, in the recorded format. But we know that it's never going to sound natural. And this is something that like people who are audiophiles, I think sometimes sort of get wrong, where the idea is to get the natural sound from a stereo system, let's say. But I don't think it works like that. They would be surprised that the acoustic bass that they think sounds really natural is actually distorted to sound natural in the stereo system,
It's interesting you bring that up, because I like stereo equipment. I like nice sounding music reproduction. But the thing where I abandoned that as a pursuit was every few years you might change a component. Oh, I'm going to try a different turntable or a different receiver, or there's new speakers or whatever. And it completely changes the sound. You could change one component and it completely changes the sound reproduction, which led me to believe there is no transparency. There is no exact duplication. There is no naturalness here. This is
Exactly.
as soon as the signal, the vibration, the audio, the physics of it leave the performer, it's just all various degrees of manipulation, interpretation, flaws added, flaws taken out. I mean, it's a silly pursuit because the fun is in the processing and the transmutation. It's, I don't know, for me.
I totally agree. And talking about Sea of Hopeless Angels, because Stefano has an analog studio still, like he has also tape machines and an analog desk. Even though on one hand, I would say I can work totally in the computer, in the box, as they say, and create something beautiful. But if I do, then that is part of those limitations that you talked about. So then I accept that I can't get the exact sound that somebody else has gotten at some point, let's say, right? It's not a tool for replication. It can be, but for me, it's not, right? And this is why I love this collaboration with Stefano so much, is so I work totally in the box. Everything is digital. The recording is digital. The looping is digital. The effects are digital. Everything was recorded in headphones with a click. So like in a pretty much a dead environment, right? And then I give it to him and he makes it breathe. He puts it through speakers and re-records with microphones, like using his analog desk. He's putting like whistling on it, his voice, all sorts of strange, interesting sounds. I think it's a pretty great sounding record, but he's not afraid to also use distorted elements. So for example, like the very first sample that you hear, which is like of something, I don't even know what it is. It sounds like something breaking the first track. That sample distorts a little bit. And to me, it adds to the flavor. It's something where people would say, what is that? That is sort of unexpected, right? I like that in the process of creation, we get these imperfections. Like, for example, also, like there are certain moments where I hear a string noise that is sort of dissonant, that wasn't intended as I was playing. And again, as I was handing the material to Stefano, I was thinking, should I edit this out? Would be easy for me to edit it out. Would have taken 10 seconds to do that. But I said, no, I'm going to give it to him like that. And if he doesn't take it out, then it's meant to be there. Even though, like when I'm listening to the album now and I hear these moments, I'm still going, what's that, right? I'm still hearing it as something that I did as a mistake. But I think it's part of the texture. It's part of the musical expression.
The humanity. It's part of the humanity of it.
It's part of the humanity for sure. Yes.
Yeah. In the show notes, we're going to link to the video. We'll link to several of the videos that are out around this project, but you mentioned his analog desk. And when I was watching that part of the video of Stefano working, for whatever reason, what came to my mind was a grand piano and him sitting there sort of in the octave of middle C. He's in the middle of that desk. He was playing the desk. I'm sorry, I know it's a banal metaphor, but he was playing his studio.
And he's that kind of person, like the kind of music producer who plays with whatever is necessary for music to happen. So that means that he's also playing the musicians. I've experienced him in the studio quite often with other musicians around. And just his way of making a suggestion or putting up a new microphone, he has his really subtle ways to play the material that is the musician, him or herself, which is really special to see. So where the understanding of Music King goes much beyond the idea that it's like pressing a key on a keyboard or striking a string on a guitar, or like where it's really about the situation, where it's about the creating the situation for the music to happen. And it's wonderful. And I have to say, I'm pretty grateful that I have come into a position where I can experience this kind of creation.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On right after this break. If you enjoyed this episode of Spotlight On, please share us with a friend and leave a review or star rating on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks. And now, back to Spotlight On. It was really a treat that you guys chose to include the videos of each of you working separately, because it's just a different way to experience the final product, the finished music. But when he was working, he's working the faders and he's working the equipment, but then there's another cut where he's at a microphone and he's doing those vocal pieces, and then he's playing a bass. I mean, I would have been surprised if there was like a tuba and a xylophone. He's just grabbing stuff. It was so fun to watch. So fun to watch. But then you talked a little bit earlier about the technology and the flavor. I think, I forget the exact language you used, but basically how the technology has its own character or its own characteristics. And I think that's really illustrated and exemplified in Aldo Grazzi's videos. In preparation for our time together, I really spent some quiet moments watching the videos and listening to the music. The recurring thought I had was, I would love to be in an immersive environment with these videos projected and this music sort of all around me loud. A few things occur to me. One is these almost 40-year-old videos being so sort of relevant to this modern music, and the way they're so sympathetic, but also this notion of like collaboration across space and time. Like there's a very metaphysical element to this that shouldn't be ignored.
Exactly. Ever since music got recorded, we have this, because the preservation or conservation, right, of sound, now that we have digital media, we can listen over and over again without degradation of quality. That's also why when the first digital samplers started happening in the early 80s and mid 80s, and hip hop and rap music started happening, and like you had a track or a bass line from a Cheek track that was like 5 years later, or even only 3 years later, used in a hip hop track that became very famous. There already we had the smearing of space and time. The recorded music makes it possible to reference, and not only to reference, but also to reuse music, musical phrases, musical recordings. And like with the tools that we have available nowadays, they can be recontextualized like completely. You can like retune Luciano Pavarotti singing an aria that's originally in minor. You can make that major if you want. Like nowadays, there's no limits anymore with modern technology. I don't think that it's really potentially can get much worse than it already is, because the possibilities are already endless. And yes, Aldo Grazzi's work, which Stefano has worked with Aldo back then in the 80s, and he had seen the videos, and he was already, I think, back then making sounds to it, but it really clicked for him with the project we did together, that, with this album, Sea of Hopeless Angels, that now there's actually finally the right companion to Aldo's videos from the 80s. And I remember that he didn't have them readily available. He had to find the videotapes. He had to go buy a machine, a video player to actually play them back, and then to find a way to digitize them. And so it was a whole ordeal of getting them revived. And Aldo at that point was already very ill. I think that also Stefano had a hunch that Aldo may not be around forever, which unfortunately Aldo died a few months ago. Do you know that moment when you have a little bit of a déjà vu? Like you're sitting somewhere with somebody, and there's like just the flash of, I've seen this scene before, I've heard those words before, or something like that. And in a way, that's what, to me, like the combination of Aldo's videos from 40 years ago, or actually they were from the early 80s, so it's maybe already 42, 43 years old, right?
Yeah.
In combination with our, as you say, contemporary music, it's like a match made in heaven, as they say.
Yeah. There is something very interesting that I've noticed as a recurring motif or aesthetic, which is that late 70s, early 80s visual look. It was almost like digital in an analog context. They were just getting computer motion graphics and things of that nature. We're just starting to become more, they were moving out of academia and into commercial settings. That aesthetic is very attractive. It kind of reminds me of what futurism was in the 50s and early 60s. There's that mid-century aesthetic of what the future looked like back then. with rounded corners and a lot of plastic. But this was what the future looked like visually in the early 80s. But I don't know, I find it very attractive and resonant.
If we look at technology, I think it's the transition from analog to digital where I think that's what you're talking about. It's that where both was happening at the same time, where it was like just the marriage of the two worlds, let's say. Then in the mid 80s, where things were like 90% over on the digital side already, things were sounding different, things were looking different. That's like the age that sounds super dated, right? Or looks super dated also in terms of like video technology and stuff like that, right? But I think it's mostly when worlds meet, and we're kind of like back to the idea of collaboration there. So in a way, it's the analog equipment or the analog way of doing things combined with, okay, now I can program my drum machine here, my Linn drum, to have a kick and snare and like a hi-hat that sounds like a mosquito, right? But I still have to record it onto analog tape. And that's where the marriage of the media kind of happens and where it creates something really beautifully deep and rich and something that you can't replicate easily.
I'm having a little bit of an epiphany here at hearing you say this, because what's occurring to me is that you think about this era, let's call it even the early mid-70s into the early mid-80s, where you have music like even Pink Floyd or Kraftwerk, or if you fast forward a little bit later, Human League or New Order. That early synth pop from the UK was that marriage of analog and digital. And that music is much more interesting than what was happening even 5 or 7 years later. Not more interesting, but we go back to that. The Cure, we go back to that much more now because it was straddling those lines of analog equipment, nascent digital equipment, still people playing analog instruments, still making mistakes, not this perfection or this precision. And I think that's something that's interesting to me right now. I talk about it a lot with guests here. There are musical movements popping up a lot in Western Europe and Germany in particular, where this electroacoustic marriage of improvised music meets electronic music, or jazz people playing with beats-oriented people. And I think I find that music so attractive because aesthetically it has that same feel. I recognize that feel. I've been struggling to articulate that for a while, but this helps me make sense of it.
It goes a little bit further even. And I think it moves away from the medium or the music itself also. I'm in Berlin now, and Berlin as one of the places where techno music was not really invented, but like maybe Detroit and Berlin or something, right?
There was a dialogue.
There was dialogue, but what was happening really is that, okay, it's one thing to have a setup of 2 Roland machines, like a bass line and a rhythm computer, and you listen to that, you sit there and listen to that. That's one thing in a room, and maybe you have a bass amp that you're running it through. So it has like, already there, it has sort of like a visceral quality. But the visceral quality then is that people started dancing to it. So really the color or the grit, the dirt, like that music used to carry with it in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, was not necessarily just the sound of it. It was also the sweat of the people that were dancing to it. It's the context, the cultural context, and the actual people experiencing it. So that's why, to this day, for me, when I listen to a classic techno track on my computer, it doesn't work that well. Listen to it on vinyl, much better, okay? But listen to it on an original tape that my friend Bernhard, again, made in '89, listening it from that cassette tape. That's where I get the real feeling. That's where sort of like the sweat and the dirt is burned into the tape with the sound. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's really...
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Something else that strikes me about Sea of Hopeless Angels is that now I didn't see the films that sort of influenced the work, Wings of Desire or Far Away So Close.
Yes, yes.
My understanding from the themes is, and it seems even more poignant with Aldo's passing, is this dialogue between our material plane and the sort of other dimension where there are, you know, whatever metaphor you use in your tradition for the departed or the transitioned. And this project it's an odd mirror to that. And again, added to that with Aldo's passing. How does that feel as someone who was in the midst of that creative process?
The interesting thing is that in this case, with this album, like the names for the pieces and for the album didn't come last, but it was certainly not there before the music was there. I came up with the title Sea of Hopeless Angels, and it just came to me just like this, not necessarily with a meaning attached to it yet.
Wow.
But a vibe. So there's a vibe that is sort of like, you could say between the lines, but since this is just one line, it's between the words or between the letters.
This is the creative angle again.
It is the creative angle. Exactly. And so like the idea of like a sea, right? And hopelessness and the angelic. And in a way, it's sort of like another, I mean, that like in hindsight, like I didn't think about that before. In hindsight, it's just another metaphor for what it feels like to me to be a creative person in this world, where there is like a vast sea, right? And there is like the hopelessness of like, can I share this discovery? I would call it that. It's like my act of opening myself up to be inspired by something that's greater than myself. How is that going to communicate? Or is it even going to communicate? Is it important? Is it only for me? Obviously, because it was done with Stefano. But like even at the point where I only had the improvisations, I felt that way about it. For me as an artist, I'm creating basically into the void, like for the void, you could say. But then that's not where we stop, right? Because when we record, when we make that product that people can repeatedly listen to, then there is this other layer of almost feeling as if you had given birth. And that's sort of like what is in those titles for me. This void or this space where you go from total joy to depression or hopelessness and love. It's all there. It's all always there. And it's a melting pot of those things. It's not that you have to go northeast to find love. No, like it's everywhere. That's sort of what music means to me. And I think this is a metaphor that David Lynch used. Like you are basically just fishing the things that are there. You're fishing them out of that void, out of that space, and you're presenting it. You're kind of like a gardener or whatever metaphor there.
A channel, yeah.
It's a channel, but it's more than just a channel because a channel, it does not have to be active. A channel can just channel without attaching anything.
Yeah.
But the idea that that I'm attaching myself, say emotionally, to complete a project, to bring it to an end, to have that final product, that's what really is the creative act in the end. It's not so much about the original inspiration, let's say. It's about like birth again, you know. It's not that you're giving birth, like at least we humans, we give birth, and then it takes 20 years, let's say, until you can let that being go out into the world on its own, right? So, and it's really like more about the bringing up of the child than the making of the child. That's, for me, all of these connotations are in those titles and also in the emotions I'm getting when I'm listening to that music.
You can sit on top of a pretty expansive body of work at this point with hopefully much more to come. But as you survey your work, do you recognize recurring themes? Is there a philosophical through line in your work?
I guess the thing that we've been discussing in the last 40 minutes, that's sort of like the philosophy. I wouldn't call it that. It's not a philosophy. It's just an expression of who I am in this world. I wouldn't even say that it's really who I am, but it's what I do, actually. You know, and then that's not the same thing. But musically, there are certainly themes. But I don't see it as like that I'm repeating. I can just sit down and do something in the style of what Markus did in 1998. I can do that. But for me, it's about acquiring an extra level of awareness or facility that makes it interesting for me to maybe do something in the style of what Markus did. The feedback I'm getting from my listeners is that they don't feel that there's anything, and maybe those people that find what I do repetitive don't tell me. But anyway, like I wouldn't really make music if there wasn't a need for it. There's always a why. And in most cases, I can tell you why.
I don't know where I stumbled across this notion. It may have been reading something else about you or a quote that you said, but could you talk to me about the role or the importance of experimentation to you in your work?
It's a good question because the word experimentation, it can be defined in many different ways. Because I study sciences, I study psychology, and I know how to design proper experiment that gives you scientific results. So when I'm talking about experimentation, I may have a completely different definition of that than other people, right? I find that I'm hardly ever experimenting. What I mean by that is that the experiment I do is not designed to fail. The experiment is always designed to be successful. And so like now I say, how is that possible? It's possible by accepting the outcome. So no matter which experiment I'm running, rather than trying to correct its outcome, I just accept the outcome for what it is. Like the example with leaving some wrong notes in the mixes for Sea of Hopeless Angels, they're not wrong. I accept that I did that. And I think that's really the challenge that most people who are actually creative people, but who haven't found a way to get their creativity out there, that's where they struggle with. It's the self-censorship. And so really, I'm running experiments, and there's one album which comes to mind just now. It's Oculus, it's called. Nothing is Sacred, I called it. It's a tongue-in-cheek. Nothing is sacred, because I did create something that is absolutely wrong, given all the things that people would tell you what music actually is and how music should be made. Rather than saying, okay, we've done the session, it sounds kind of like wacky or strange, and can we fix it? I say, no, we're not going to fix it. We're going to just present it exactly the way it is, because this was not an experiment. This was a process. It was a process to create something. So that's where you go. That's my answer. Experiment doesn't really exist for me. It's all process and acceptance of the outcome.
That's very interesting, though, Markus, because obviously I'm not going to argue with you about your interpretation of your work, but it's fascinating to hear you say it that way, because that's almost a description of, at least how I understand, a scientific experiment. First of all, just to draw analogies, the idea that you would take out some of the mistakes, to me, is analogous to tampering with the data.
Yes.
A scientific experiment doesn't succeed or fail. It either proves or disproves the hypothesis. So the result is not a failure or a success. It's an outcome, and you live with that outcome, and then you choose to iterate or not. But it's very interesting that you're distinguishing between experiment when it sounds almost exactly like.
You know, the reason why I said it this way is that you're talking to me as an artist right now. And that's the difference. And that's also what I was saying. That's usually the hurdle for a lot of people, is that the acceptance of the outcome is the problem. For me, an experiment is a scientific experiment. But me, like using a new effects pedal or changing the process of my looping in my laptop, is not an experiment. It's process. I'm changing the process of making music or manipulating sound. Just like the question that, or the statement that a lot of people make, that music is a language, for example. To me, it's absurd to call music a language. But for somebody, it may be exactly that, because they're thinking about the thing very completely differently.
Yeah.
And anyway, so the word experiment or experimentation, I would say, does not apply to what I do. At least not from my perspective. It's just process. Yeah.
When you talk about the word process, that has some very specific meanings. Again, we could play around with it a little bit linguistically, but do you create process music in the definition of a Steve Reich or a, I don't know, David Lang? Is process music what you make in certain projects?
I think in most projects I'm making process music, yes, but with very loose parameters, let's say. Even going on tour with Pat Maslotta on Trey Gunn, and as tuner, we go on stage, we improvise 1/3 of the show. 1/3 of the show is process music because we define the process. We say we're just going to play. But it's a very loose process, obviously, but it's a process. It's a restriction. You could think of it as a restriction rather than the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Playing freely is a restriction, right? So, but no, there is a project in particular, actually there are more than one, but I'm only talking about one publicly, which is called Kid Arrow. Kid Arrow is on Bandcamp, and it's a project that I started in Osaka a couple years ago. I discovered a musical generative process in my laptop that I designed and discovered it, and have since created about, I don't know how many, 60 pieces now, 60 pieces with that process, or like, obviously the process always evolves. It's total process music. So there's no intervention whatsoever. I'm just setting it up and then I'm bouncing it out, and it's a piece of music. And it's very fascinating. It's actually the project I'm most interested in, and that's closest to my heart at the moment. It's Kid Arrow. And I really encourage you to check it out.
I will.
It's very special. It's because I'm very much coming from a background of, as I said, of trying to discover new things. Some people that say, oh, everything's already been done, or no matter what you do, it's just a recombination of something that some other people have already done. I still don't believe that. I think we have so many ways to discover new sounds that we should also like go after them. And Kid Arrow is one of those canvases, empty canvases, where I go for like new harmonic material. Also, I'm working a lot with rhythmic stuff that other people are not doing well. Like all the, say, 12 parts of the piece progress at different speeds, for example. Each part has a different tempo. But then to like make sure to turn that into coherent musical statement and not just cacophony. It's very close to my heart, right? It's .com.
I will make sure that not only do I listen to it immediately after we hang up, but we'll link to it from the show. So Tuner is up next. Like, you're going to be hitting the road again. I'm going to see you in a few weeks. You're going to be here.
Yeah, we're going to be starting in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we're going to slowly go over to California, and then slowly go all the way up to Seattle and also to Vancouver. That's going to be the last show in Vancouver, I think. And that's going to be in May. Yeah, May 2024, and we're really looking forward to doing that. It's always an adventure, and it's really special music. We sort of like have three things we do. We, like I said, 1/3 of the show is improvised. Then we play some of the more complex King Crimson music from the early 2000s, really demanding music to play as well as to listen to, I think. And then there is music from Trey Gunn's and my back catalog that we interpret as a trio. It's a wonderful thing.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And actually, I don't know if you remember Robert Fripp, Trey Gunn, and David Sylvian made an album in '93 called The First Day. It's really highly recommended.
Yeah.
It's also largely improvisational, and we have taken some of those, two of those themes, and actually improvise around those also in that show. So again, like this idea of that there's sort of a way to reintegrate the past into the now in arts. I see it slightly differently. I see it as if I'm here in the, here and now, and I can build a bridge that starts in the past. So it's almost like time traveling, right? I can build that bridge, but I do not build it starting from here in the present, and I still start when it goes back into the past. No, I'm here, and I start building the bridge in the past, and then the bridge reaches over into my present moment. And that's sort of like how I see lineage, like as a composer, and also like tradition. I love musical tradition. I think it's very important for a musician to know musical tradition, because That's where you're drawing your energy from. It's not really that you're, like I say, you're repurposing musical phrases or ideas or something. No, it's an actual untangible energy that you can activate by being creative yourself. And it's that bridge building that I'm interested in as an artist.
I would argue the deeper ongoing familiarity with the lineage actually helps the artist find their voice.
Oh, for sure. And for me, it's fascinating to sometimes see how, like this game of, what is it called? 6 Steps with a famous actor, with Kevin Bacon, I think. Like how many?
Oh, 6 degrees.
6 degrees, exactly. Like the 6 degrees thing. And as I get older and as I become more aware of my lineage and my influences, I can now see that it's way less than 6 degrees for me to almost anybody. I can trace who I am as an artist, like in 1 or 2 steps, to almost anybody whose work I enjoy.
In that metaphor, I think Brian Eno is the stand-in for Kevin Bacon, and everybody ends up 6 degrees from Brian Eno.
Exactly. We can easily end up with strange things like that. In the middle of May, Bill Bruford was born, Robert Fripp was born, Brian Eno, Mike Oldfield. They're all within like 3 or 4 days of each other, and there are many more. I've always wondered, like, why is that, right?
It had to have something to do with the end of World War II. It had to have something to do.
Yes. But why that month? I mean, I don't know. That I personally don't really believe in anything as something that you should really believe in. But I believe in the power of oracles. And we as human beings have the freedom to create, ideally, our own oracle, or we can use any oracle we like. So we're allowed to not act as if we're machines. And as we know, it's going to become even more important that we're going to act as humans and not as machines.
That we master the tools and the tools don't master us. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much once again, Markus Reuter. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host and executive producer, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and edited by Michael Donaldson, with theme music by Q-Burn's Abstract Message. If you'd like to support our work, please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, or visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, weekly postings on our official blog, and a ton more. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.